unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Arlene Foster. Well, we'll be kicking off the show with our big debate this week, focusing on immigration. The government is bracing itself for the release of the Office for National Statistics annual migration figures. And if you thought the figure of 500,000 from last year was big, this year's annual figure is set to be even higher. Plus, we'll be talking all about the rising price of food, hearing this time from the men and women who actually produce it. Just what is going on with Britain's farmers? Then, a subject that I've become close to thanks to the tireless campaigning of one woman whose visionary businessman husband was killed in a quad bike accident. She wants the UK government to make it mandatory for all quad bikes to have roll bars fitted. I put the question to the government in the House of Lords. And later in the programme, we'll be asking whether you should be bothered to weed your garden. Plus, we'll enter the murky world of espionage as we're joined by two former intelligence officers looking at the intelligence battle being waged between Russia and the United States in Ukraine. But before all of that, here's your latest news headlines.
Arlene, thank you. Good morning. Here's your latest headlines from the GB newsroom at 11:11. Opposition leaders are calling for an investigation after it emerged the Home Secretary tried to avoid incurring points on her driving licence for speeding last summer. The Sunday Times reports Suella Braverman asked a civil servant to organise a one-to-one driving awareness course instead. Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper described the allegations as shocking, saying Miss Braverman's role is to uphold the law. And yet she abused her position to get around it. Well, when asked about the claims, the Prime Minister declined to support Miss Braverman.
I don't know the full details of what has happened, nor have I spoken to the Home Secretary. I think you can see firsthand what I've been doing over the last day or so. But I understand that she's expressed regret for speeding, accepted the penalty and paid the fine.
On the final day of the G7 summit in Japan, the Prime Minister told world leaders China poses the biggest challenge to global security. Rishi Sunak says the country is increasingly authoritarian at home and assertive abroad, being the only country with both the means and intent to reshape the world order. He confirmed Western leaders are working together to de-risk against the vulnerability of supply chain issues and hostile investment. Rishi Sunak also hailed the President of Ukraine's attendance at the summit as historic. This morning, Volodymyr Zelensky and Japan's Prime Minister visited the Peace Memorial Park in Hiroshima. They've taken part in a wreath-laying ceremony at the cenotaph for the victims of the atomic bomb. Zelensky's also holding bilateral talks with his Japanese counterpart, and we're expecting him to make a speech later. Meanwhile, President Zelensky called the situation in eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut a tragedy, but he didn't confirm that it had fallen to Russian control. When asked if the city had been captured, he said, "I think not," but he did admit there's nothing left there. Wagner mercenary forces who have led the assault claim to have finally pushed Ukrainians out of the city, and President Vladimir Putin has congratulated them for what he called a liberation. The Environment Secretary says scrapping all EU laws would boost the UK's domestic wine industry by £180 million. A number of Brussels regulations that were retained after Brexit will be dropped as part of the retained EU law bill, including some that impact the wine sector. Therese Coffey's comments come after the government watered down plans to scrap all EU laws. Just 600 will now be removed from British statute books rather than the 4,000 pledged. The Labour leader is expected to warn the NHS is not sustainable unless serious and long-term reforms are made. Sir Keir Starmer will make a speech in the east of England to set out fundamental changes, extra investment and performance targets tomorrow. The Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has previously called government plans to use private sector capacity a short-term fix. And Sinn Féin has become the largest party in local government in Northern Ireland for the first time after making large gains in the elections. The party's Vice President, Michelle O'Neill, described her victory as momentous and said the results sent a message that Stormont should return to power sharing. DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson admitted lessons needed to be learnt from the results, but said his party had polled strongly. Sinn Féin now hold 144 seats, whilst the DUP has 122 and the Alliance Party has 67. You're up to date on GB News. Now it's back to Arlene.
Well, welcome back and thanks to Bethany. Well, a political row is already brewing over the level of immigration to the United Kingdom as the government prepares for the publication of annual net migration figures by the Office for National Statistics on Thursday. Last year's data showed inward migration of more than 500,000 people, and this year it's anticipated the figure could be even higher, somewhere in the region of 600,000 to 1 million. Rishi Sunak says that's too high and pledged to bring it down, but he's been a little vague about exactly how much. Well, Catherine Foster has been following this story for us, and she joins us now live from Portsmouth.
Can you hear anything? You give that to me.
Oh dear, it looks as if Catherine's having some difficulty there. So let's discuss this now with Henry Hill, the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, and Aaron Bastani, who is the founder of Novara Media. Welcome to the show, both of you. Well, we're looking forward to these figures that are coming out later on in the week. But Henry, this has been a constant thorn in the side for Conservative Prime Ministers, and it looks as if it's going to continue to be so.
Yeah, because they're not really doing any of the work that you'd need to do to actually bring down headline legal migration figures. Essentially, what each government, going back to David Cameron, has done is they've announced some headline target. You know, his was famously the hundreds of thousands. And then they've assigned the Home Office the job of trying to hit that as best it can and play the bad guy. Meanwhile, every other government department, be that education, be that health, be that business, they all still see migration as a short-term fix. You know, it brings in more labour, it brings in more skills, it brings in more taxpayers, whatever it is. If you actually wanted over the medium to long term to bring down legal migration, you'd have to look at restructuring our economy, you'd have to look at making businesses invest more in training, you'd have to be prepared to kind of force some business sectors to raise wages to attract workers rather than declaring everything a shortage occupation and allowing them to hire in cheaply from overseas. But because that thinking has not been done, and it's certainly not going to be done by a Prime Minister who came up through the Treasury, we are instead left with this game where the Home Office complains about the numbers and every other government department demands more of them.
Thanks for that, Henry. We are now able to go back to Catherine, so if both of you stay with me, we'll hear what Catherine has been following. She's been down in Portsmouth for the People's Panel and been speaking to people there. Catherine, tell us what you've been hearing.
Yes, a lot of talk about immigration now, isn't there? Of course, Rishi Sunak made it a pledge to stop the boats. A lot of focus from the government on stopping illegal crossings, but very little until recently about the level of legal migration. Of course, last year it was 500,000. That's more than double what it was when Boris Johnson came in 2019, when it was around 220,000 a year. And it was a manifesto pledge of the Conservatives to get those numbers down. It seems a very long time ago, doesn't it, since David Cameron said they would get it down to the tens of thousands. So figures coming out on Thursday from the Office for National Statistics expected to show that net legal migration somewhere between 600 and 700,000, possibly even as high as 1 million. And already very visible splits emerging within the cabinet. Now, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, talking in Hiroshima at the end of the G7 summit, saying yes, he believes legal migration is too high. Yes, they want to bring it down. The question is how? Obviously, the government now does have control. We didn't while we were in the EU with free movement. The government can choose who to let in. But of course, one of the things that has happened is the level of the numbers of students coming to this country has risen significantly, especially the numbers on postgraduate courses who also bring dependents with them. And the student then can stay for 2 years after they finish the course and often are doing fairly low-skilled work. Now, Brian Bell, who's the government's migration czar, has said that he warned the government some 5 years ago that this system was open to abuse. And I think the government's going to find itself in real difficulties when these figures emerge, because, of course, there's huge pressure on public services. And also we have a massive housing crisis in this country. So how sustainable is it really if 700,000 or 800,000 people are coming in every year?
Catherine, thanks so much for bringing us a view from Portsmouth today. And I'm going to go back to my two guests now, Henry Hill and Aaron Bastani. And Aaron, listening to Catherine there, and she actually underlined the point that Henry made about the other departments in government not actually being involved in this issue as well. And she mentioned the Education Department, she mentioned the Housing Department. But I was just noticing from the Sunday Telegraph this morning that they're saying since 2018, the number of postgraduate student dependents has risen from 16,000 to 135,000. That's unsustainable, surely, isn't it?
Well, a large chunk of that is obviously European nationals who prior to 2020, 2021 would have been coming over with freedom of movement, and that's changed. But you're right, there's clearly something which has shifted with regards to immigration from undergraduate and graduate students and their dependents. Huge chunk of this is the partners, wives, husbands, and sometimes children of the people coming over here to study. What we saw after 2010, when David Cameron committed to immigration falling to the, quote, tens of thousands, was actually a real clamping down on people being able to study here. It was probably the one thing he tried to do, he and his administration tried to do, in bringing immigration figures down. What we've seen, I think, in the last several years is a bit of a volte-face on that. Partly because many British universities, I mean, I actually have to say I agreed with virtually everything Henry, not virtually, I agreed with everything Henry said. But one thing he missed out is the extent to which British universities and British higher education are dependent for their funding, often on high-value overseas students, particularly in postgraduate courses. So we need to not only remake how we employ people, our labour market, how we produce things, we also need to really consider how we're going to fund higher education in this country if we don't have the golden goose right now, which is overseas students.
And I think that's a fair point, Henry, isn't it? Because it's a whole-of-government approach that's needed, and that's the point you've been making about the Home Office. But in terms of the whole of government, in terms of Cabinet, there's not unanimity on how to deal with this. That's the problem.
No, absolutely not, because most departments don't have an incentive to bring immigration down, right? Like, especially given the life cycle of most ministers and the timeline of most treasury kind of fiscal assessments, everything is the next 1 year, 2 year, 5 years. And on that metric, forcing people to invest in domestic training and so on is a long-term payoff. You know, there are things you can do. For example, there are such as the volume of international students that it suggests, I think, that there might be scope for hiking international student fees, which would cause some numbers to fall, but the per student amount paid higher. And you could maybe manage to bring in the same amount of money with fewer people. But again, the Conservatives have to think about. Do they want the higher education sector to be as big as it is, given that the graduate premium for many people taking degrees is essentially non-existent? Could they not rethink that? But that's exactly the kind of thinking that they need to do, and they haven't been doing it. But as long as we have a broken dependency ratio, we have an aging population, and we need more workers, we need to keep the NHS stocked up, and we need to keep universities propped up with foreign money, we're never going to bring headline immigration down. And no Conservative Prime Minister since they entered government in 2010 has faced up to that reality.
So, Aaron, is it time to have a more honest conversation about migration and the fact that the things that we have talked about today, education, NHS, the need to have those workers in place, is something that people will just have to recognise?
Partly yes and no. So I think on, for instance, the NHS and healthcare, Britain's NHS is dependent upon overseas workers to an extraordinary extent. And the World Health Organization has repeatedly said, stop taking healthcare workers from places like Nigeria because you're undermining their own ability to maintain a domestic healthcare infrastructure. You're taking too many nurses, midwives, etc., for those countries to actually sustain what they've already got. And they're actually going backwards in many instances. On the other hand, because we're refusing to give pay rises to junior doctors, to nurses, etc., and your viewers and listeners can agree or disagree with that, what we're facing right now is the prospect of around 1 in 3 junior doctors looking to go overseas, many nurses being attracted by the prospect of earning more money in places not only like the US or Canada or Australia, but also the Gulf states. Also happening, by the way, it should be said, with teachers. So I think we do need an honest debate, and I'd say it needs to be honest in 2 respects. Firstly, there's a great deal of focus and emphasis on the, quote, small boats. And I understand it's a very emotional issue. The images that evokes are very powerful images. But the reality is it's a very small chunk of immigration into this country. And I do feel that the Conservatives focus on that precisely to distract people away from their very poor record on their own terms in regards to entirely legal migration. The problem is not illegal migration. The problem, if you think we have too many people coming here, let's say it's between 700,000 and 1 million, the overwhelming majority of those people are coming here legally. And the Conservatives, because they're failing on that, want to talk about the small boats. Then finally, in terms of an honest conversation, if we do want to plug the gaps in places like the NHS with fewer people coming over from overseas, we're going to have to pay people more. And also we're going to have to reconsider things like student debt. A nurse graduates now with £56,000 worth of debt on average. Of course, they're more likely to go to Dubai or the US, where they can earn more and they can perhaps, not have to worry about that debt for 5-10 years or maybe not even return. So I think the honesty works in 2 ways, both in terms of legal migration, but also we need a really different kind of economic sector.
Yeah, but also we need to have the discussion about the fact that we have 5 million people on long-term sickness benefit. I mean, that is something that is a problem for us here in the UK, those people who are economically inactive. And is it not time that we dealt with those issues, Henry Hill, as well?
Well, it is, but I think that the issue with the debate about the economically inactive is, again, would it be great if we cleared the health backlog and people who are unable to work because they have a fixable ailment or a treatable ailment are able to get back to work? Absolutely. But it's slightly problematic when what you end up with is that you end up with the Treasury, for example, trying to chivvy people who are comfortably retired back into work. Because whatever you think about the effect that would have on the GDP statistics, it does sort of conjure the image of a Britain where your primary use is as a sort of cog in the Treasury's GDP machine, right? And the Treasury will, whether you want to be a stay-at-home parent or a retiree or whatever else, the Treasury doesn't leave you room to do that. With the NHS, there are all kinds of things the government could have done. For example, it could have reversed Margaret Thatcher's disastrous decision to make nursing a graduate profession. It used to be the case that you went into nursing straight out of school and you learned on the job and you earned as you did so. That was better for all concerned. It could currently, we cap the number of medical places that we have for doctors because the government pays for them, but then those doctors are free to immediately seek work overseas. The government could lift that cap and in exchange, say, pay down a share of the student loan for each given year that a medical graduate works in the NHS to try and actually make that reward tied to NHS service. There are all kinds of imaginative things the government could have done to try and change some of these issues, get rid of these bottlenecks. But again, they haven't done any of them. Whether you agree or disagree with any of these proposals, they have done nothing to change the fundamental model, which is that we train British medical staff at huge expense. export them to jurisdictions that will pay them better. And then, as Aaron says, we import people who have been trained more cheaply in low-cost jurisdictions and often leave those places struggling with their own medical systems as a consequence.
Well, Henry and Aaron, I'm sure we'll be talking about this for the rest of the week, no doubt, and it'll be interesting to see what the government response is. But thank you for coming on the show to talk about it this morning. Now, you're watching Sunday with Arlene Foster and GB News, Britain's news channel, and in a few minutes we'll be talking about the challenges facing farmers amid the cost of living crisis and one woman's campaign to make quad bikes safer.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to the show. Well, several politicians have rounded on supermarkets as the cost of food rises higher and higher with every passing day. Food prices spiked by almost 20% in the year to March, with some products like eggs almost doubling in price. That's prompted the Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey to accuse supermarkets of profiteering. And what about the men and women who put in so long hours to produce that food? Well, to get the farmer's perspective on all of this, I'm joined by the farmer and wholesaler, David Catt. David, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Well, David, give us an idea, for those people who don't come from a farming background and are finding it difficult to understand, why is the price of food going up so rapidly?
Basically because production is falling off a cliff at the moment. Post-Brexit, we created this labour vacuum where we used to have casual seasonal labour coming from Europe every season to pick the fruit and apples. That's stopped now. The the actual paperwork involved in doing visas is phenomenal. Unless you're a very big company, have an HR department, it's just impractical. So a lot of growers now are stopping to produce this food. I mean, the egg producers, because of electricity prices, wheat prices, feed prices went through the roof. The supermarkets weren't prepared to pay any more money because they're in a price war. And so production has just completely gone. And we're now importing most of our eggs from Poland. And what we need in this country, there's no government strategy with food. When Brexit was brought about, we're there now. The consequences of how that was going to affect the food production in the UK wasn't really thought about very much by government. And we need a government now that wants to dig for Britain style of a basis, because at the moment, fruit growers are grubbing apples because of the problems. They're planting vineyards up that they can mechanically harvest. Vegetable growers are cutting back on the acreage. Potatoes are a case in point very currently that the acreage was dropping and is dropping again for next year. Now, one of the big chip manufacturers has miscalculated its Europe-wide production of potatoes. So the chipping potatoes have gone from £300 a tonne a month ago to £800 a tonne ex-farm. And so the poor fish and chip shop trade are going to really struggle. But we need some more policy.
Yeah, and I was listening to Therese Coffey on the Camilla Tominey show earlier on. I don't know whether you heard her. She was talking about fairness in the supply chain and the need for everybody to be able to have that equity. Do you think that government recognises the difficulties that you're talking about, David? And if so, are they going to be able to solve them? Because we've seen the Farm to Fork summit in Downing Street. Undoubtedly, that raised the issue. But obviously, you feel that there's more need to have policies that work.
Absolutely, because within the EU there was the CAP, so there was a food supply policy because it created a guaranteed supply at a known cost. That's what that did in fact. But where we are now, the cost of production now is so high, and with the supermarkets that have been allowed to control our food industry from a growing point of view, from a selling point of view, I'm very anti-supermarkets because to our way of thinking, and it was to supply them, you're not your own boss any longer, where it needs a better supply chain, really.
Yeah. And do you feel that you get support from the supermarket yourself, or indeed the wider farming community? Do they feel supported by the supermarkets, or do they see the supermarkets as, yes, the route to market, but people who are taking more profits than they should?
It's basically a monopoly. They've got a cartel running between them, and they control and dictate the prices. I mean, the cost of production bears no resemblance to the price they pay back to the farmers. Now, if you're packing for them, there's a known cost and a known price, and if it's not paying, you won't pack for them. So the packers earn money. But when it comes to creating a price structure for the products, it's entirely in their hands. And the shortage in supply we had in the spring with the salad stuff from Spain and North Africa. All my independent shops, we supplied absolutely everything every day throughout the whole of the period. There were no shortages whatsoever. We just had to pay the money. If you pay the money for the produce comes here. And the Spaniards now don't need to send here because they can make more money within Europe. And we're last port of call now.
Yeah. Well, David, thanks for explaining that so clearly for our listeners and viewers today. And no doubt we'll come back to this issue again, because it's something that we at GB News want to keep highlighting, particularly for our farming viewers right across the UK. Thanks again to David Catt. Well, we're sticking with farms now, but from a very different subject. Dennis Lynn was a farmer and entrepreneur who had variously been described as an innovator and visionary. The founder of Finnebrogue Artisan in Northern Ireland, he pioneered new foods and products that supplied both supermarket shelves and indeed some of Britain's top restaurants. Tragically, Dennis was killed in a quad bike accident 2 years ago, and his wife, Christine, is now campaigning for quad bikes to have mandatory roll bars to prevent further deaths like her husband's. Recently, in response to a question by myself in the House of Lords, the UK government said it had no plans to make roll bars mandatory. Well, I'm very pleased to say that I'm now joined by Christine over in County Down in Northern Ireland. Christine, lovely to see you, and thanks for joining me this morning. Christine, you lost your husband, Dennis, in a quad bike accident. And before we talk about what you want to see happening, tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about Dennis and who he was.
Oh, right. How long do we have got, Arlene? Dennis, basically Dennis at 15, his dad died when he was 15, so he had to grow up pretty fast. He also was expelled from school, and after that he went on to get several sales jobs, which he realised he actually was very good at. He decided then to go out on his own. He bought a wee white van, he sold pizzas, sauces and pies, and then he got the franchise for chilled chips from Holland, and that was the start of Lynn's Country Foods. The company was very successful, and in 1991 Dennis then bought part of Finnebrook Estate here in Downpatrick. He went on to farm suckler cows, and then he was diagnosed with cancer, and BSE also came in at that time as well. So there was a real sort of shift and a change, and then we decided, right, we've got 600 acres here, what do we do? So the next thing was to go into deer farming, which we knew absolutely nothing about, but that didn't deter Dennis. We probably had about 3,000 deer in the farm, but the only problem was then there was no outlet for venison. But Dennis, of course, was very good at sales, so he decided, right, I'm going to build an abattoir on the farm here, and we were the largest deer farm in UK. But we had, over those years, many planning issues, which I know you are aware of, pressure from the bank, but he never gave up. And then we started to supply Marks and Spencer's with venison, and they got very confident with Dennis and with Finnebrook, and they asked us would we start supplying their pork sausages, which we did, and now we supply Marks and Spencer's with all their pork sausages. But the factory grew, we outgrew the factory, so we built a state-of-the-art factory in 2016, which opened, and at that point we were supplying all major retailers with our sausages. But then it was on to the next chapter. Dennis always got very bored. Whenever he had completed something, I got it right, it was on to the next thing. So in 2018, he then launched the first nitrite-free bacon in the United Kingdom, very well-known brand called Naked Bacon. And I suppose its success was the health benefits, that there's no nitrites in it, and nitrites can cause cancer, which Dennis was very passionate about because he had cancer. And probably the only fear in Dennis's life was that he would die of cancer. But thank God he was a positive story. But food trends then started to change. So the next chapter was making and supplying retailers with vegetarian and vegan products. So we went on to do that. And then he decided to build the largest plant-based factory in the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, Dennis never got to see this factory fully completed, but thankfully over the last 2 years, the Finnebrook team are continuing Dennis's legacy, and in fact, we recently won an award for the best plant-based factory in the United Kingdom. During lockdown, Dennis then became very conscious of the state of our planet was in and wanted to make a difference. His way of doing this was through food. So he started Foundation Earth, and Foundation Earth basically is like the traffic lights for food. So whenever you go into the supermarket and you pick up, say, for example, a packet of our sausages, there's different points that show what it took and the damage it made to the environment to make this product. So it was launched in June 2021. Unfortunately, Dennis didn't get to see the launch of it, but thank God it's proven and it's doing really, really well.
Well, Christine, you've given us such a lovely vision of who Dennis was, and we know then he tragically had his life cut short in that quad accident. And you have now decided that you want to devote some time to campaigning on this issue. And we know that in Australia, another country where farming is very important and where quads are used a lot, it's already the law there that quad bikes must have roll bars on them. And you want to push ahead with this campaign, and tell us about what you plan to do.
Well, I suppose I feel very passionate about this campaign, and the reason being is because I lost my husband Dennis. I don't want to ban quad bikes. In fact, up until Dennis's accident, we always had several quad bikes, whether it was a sports quad or farm quads, and as soon as the kids could ride one, that's what they got for Christmas. But we have to understand a farm quad weighs 320 kilos, and if this falls on top of the rider, what chance do you have? Dennis's chest and internal organs were completely crushed. He didn't stand a chance, but if there had been roll bars, I strongly believe he would be alive today. So it's up to me to make a change in the law for Dennis and other families out there. And we talk about Australia. In Australia, 70% of quad bike accidents happen because of rollovers. In fact, the University of New South Wales found that half of the deaths caused by rollovers would have been avoided if roll bars were fitted. Studies also acknowledge that roll bars can contribute to injuries in the event of a crash, but these are likely to be very minor injuries compared to crushing without roll bars.
And of course, we asked the question to government about this issue, and I'm sure you were disappointed with the response, as indeed I was. But at least in the answer, they said that they would continue to monitor what other jurisdictions were doing. And I suppose that gives us the opportunity, doesn't it, to present more evidence in relation to the safety of these quad bikes.
Yeah, I suppose at the end of the day, I wasn't surprised by the government's response. Change isn't going to happen overnight, but there's so many unnecessary accidents over the years, so many lives changed and lost, and yet they haven't chosen to act. So I'm just going to keep presenting the evidence like that from Australia that roll bars can make a difference and demonstrate the overwhelming public support for action. I don't want anyone to suffer the fate that Dennis had, or another family to go through the pain and loss that we have had to go over the last 2 years. Since the campaign started, the local politicians have reached out in support, and I hope they will continue to help us and make roll bars mandatory.
Well, Christine, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today, and having known Dennis as a businessman, I know he'd have been incredibly proud of you and continues to be proud of you. So thanks for coming on the show today. Well, that's Christine there telling us about her inspirational husband, Dennis Lynn, and the campaign that she's involved in now. But moving on, us Brits love a cup of tea, and what better time to put the kettle on than today, International Tea Day. As the latest tea trends are released, our reporter Anna Riley brings us this report from Britain's biggest tea drinking region. Let's see where it is.
Tea. We've been drinking it in Britain since the 16th century, and with 10 million cups drunk every day in the UK, it's certainly a popular beverage. And tea production so important that the UN designated the 21st of May as International Tea Day. To tie in with this, the latest tea census found almost a quarter of Brits drink 5 cups or more every day. 77% favoured black tea and 54% rated taste as the top reason for drinking tea. But why is tea so trendy?
A big part of the work that we do at the Tea and Infusions Association is to promote tea and to encourage people to drink tea. And, we talked about the well-being benefits of drinking tea, taking a break, reducing your anxiety, but tea's also packed full of health benefits as well. So it's a great drink to introduce into your diet if you're not doing that already. And there's health benefits. You can find them in black tea and green tea. There's oolong tea, all different types of teas. And I'd recommend people just get out there and try them.
It's places like the Georgian tea rooms in Bridlington that are keeping the British tradition of afternoon tea alive.
I think the joy of the tea rooms is it's just a little bit of escapism from everyday life. People come in here as an experience. They come in for afternoon teas, and it's a sort of a slower pace of life.
With Yorkshire being named as the region with the most tea drinkers, it's not surprising that so many cups are sold here.
We do a wide selection of teas. We do fruit teas, we do herbal teas, but the winner is always the good old Yorkshire tea, always. I think it's just calming, it's refreshing. People enjoy it either first thing on the morning or when they've had a long walk exploring. They come and they sit and enjoy a nice cup of Yorkshire tea.
And for the customers, tea is part of their daily routine.
That's the drink, my go-to drink in the morning. It refreshes, it wakes you up, sets you up for the day. You know, if you're feeling a little bit groggy, sort of, you know, just gives you that time to, you boil the kettle, bit of mindfulness, you know, waiting for it, thinking what you've got ahead of the day, and then you have your tea and it's nice.
So whether you favour a builder's brew or a milkier mug, for many of us having a cuppa is simply tea-rific. Anna Riley, GB News, Bridlington.
That's the terrific Anna Riley there telling us all about tea. Well, now you're watching Sunday with Arlene Foster on GB News. In a few minutes, we'll be talking all things theatre, including the clash of the Shakespearean titans with Stefan Kyrias.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss? Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the show. Well, now let's get the rundown of what's going on in the world of theatre with Stefan Kyriazis, who is the online editor of Express Online. Stefan, I'm always staggered by the breadth of the material you manage to bring every week, but you've really surpassed yourself this time. Let's start with the musical adaptation of Brokeback Mountain that's been staged at the new Soho Place. And remind viewers of the background, or rather the script of Brokeback Mountain. What was it all about?
So it's a 1997 short story by Annie Proulx that was turned into a film by Ang Lee.
Yes.
So this is a short story, and it's a very sparse, spare, economical use of words about two cowboys, 1963. They've got to protect a herd of sheep on Brokeback Mountain through a period, and they slowly fall in love. This is 1963, Wyoming, Utah. Not a good time for men to be together. One of the characters was shown with pride by his father, local gay men that were murdered by the townsfolk. So he's grown up with this. So it's always been billed as a gay love story. It's not. It's a story about people loving in adversity. It's about loneliness. It's about finding that one person that makes sense to you, and also in impossible circumstances. And it's a very tricky thing to translate
into a musical format.
Yes, very, very much so. So this one is a theatre piece with music, not a musical.
Ah, OK.
So it's not kind of, they don't suddenly break into song, which I just think would have been a little bit ridiculous. So what they've done is, there's very little dialogue, and one of the characters, Ennis, the one that had the terrible childhood, he's monosyllabic. It's played by Heath Ledger on screen. So he mumbles. He's so terrified of expressing himself, of feeling anything, afraid of being attacked, but also afraid of love. So he barely speaks. So what you have is they've got this fantastic idea. You have a band on stage, music written by Dan Gillespie-Sells, who was in a band called The Feeling. He also wrote the music for Everybody's Talking About Jamie.
Oh, yes.
But this time, I don't know where it came from. Apparently, he grew up with country music. It's the most aching, beautiful, atmospheric, twanging, gorgeous, kind of lilting sort of soundtrack that comes between all the scenes. They've got a fantastic world champion harmonica player who's glorious, and the most stunning vocals from the lead singer, who I sat there the whole time going, she should be famous. Who is this woman? Because I don't prepare properly. Check the notes afterwards. Do you remember Fairground Attraction? Eddie Reader, that song,
Scottish
It's got
lady?
to be perfect. It's her.
Yeah.
The band is still going. Their heyday, you know, this big hit was decades ago. Her voice is deeper and richer. So she provides the feelings, the cues, the emotional links between everything all the way through. Still two very strong performances by the boys. Mike Feist, who is an American...
It's a very small, then, cast.
It's very intimate. There's the cast of 5 or 6. We are in a complete round around them. It's a dirt stage with scrub and kind of wrought iron, campfire. They cook on stage. And with the lighting, when it goes down, it's atmospheric, it's spine-tingling. You feel like you could be there. So, yeah, it's a very strong, interesting approach. I loved it.
And it's at Soho Place. Is that a small venue, or what?
It's about, I think, a 500 capacity. It's the first new theatre built in London for 50 years.
Right.
It's glorious. It's beautiful. They can rehearse shows upstairs while the next show is happening downstairs. So it's been so well thought out by producer Nika Burns. But you're all the way round, kind of tiered up very high, and your rows are only kind of 2 or 3 rows each level. It's extraordinary. It's very atmospheric.
Good, good. You enjoyed it.
I did enjoy it.
And so we're going to move on then to another interpretation. This one is Once on This Island at Regent's Park in an open-air theatre.
Yeah.
And this is based on a loose interpretation of The Little Mermaid.
Yes, this is kind of from one extreme to the other, very intimate and claustrophobic. And now Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, one of my favourite venues in the country. Stunning, massive amphitheatre, outdoors with Regent's Park behind you. You've got the trees, you go there at kind of evening twilight, the sun sets, the moon comes up. It's glorious. This is set in the Caribbean, Haiti. A young island girl rescues a rich boy, based on The Little Mermaid. But he's still dying, so she trades her soul for his with the god of death. Men, of course, no good. He goes back to his posh folk, enjoys her, but is never going to marry her. So, you know, never trust a man and never trade your soul for a man, let me tell you. But it's a fabulous, fabulous venue. And, yeah, it's not my favourite thing I've seen there. The next thing coming up there is Robin Hood. Can't think of anything better. We have the woods. And that's going to be a silly musical, and then they're also doing the Cage aux Folles.
And the open-air theatre, is that open just in the summertime, presumably?
Yeah, summer season.
Yeah.
And this is British summer.
Yeah.
It can rain.
Yeah, and what happens then when it rains?
If it rains beforehand, the show is cancelled and your tickets are either refunded or moved. If it rains during, it's a very British, I have been there and I go prepared, I take a shopping bag, plastic bag, to sit on. I've been there under an umbrella.
I was going to say, can you have umbrellas in a theatre?
It's very, very tiered. It's a very steep tier, so obviously you don't kind of hold it high up.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then you just reach the point where shall we, and they have been shows they've called off when it's just torrential. And also the actors are out on an exposed stage as well. It's not safe sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's Britain. You know.
I've often looked at that outdoor theatre in Cornwall and thought that must be amazing to be there. But our weather is such that
I know, but that's glorious. That's on the top of the cliffs near Penzance, carved out of the rocks. That's kind of with the elements.
You've obviously been, have you?
It's stunning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an incredible.
For Shakespearean tragedies or something like that, it would be amazing, I think. But just talking about Shakespearean. There's rivalry going on in Shakespeare. Tell me all about that.
Oh, it's going to be the battle of the lubbies, which we're very... it couldn't get more lubby than this. Yeah. So on one side, parked to the side, we have Kenneth Branagh, who's finally going to do his King Lear. Everyone's got to do it at some stage. So that's coming up later in the year.
And where's that going to be?
That's in London only.
Right.
So, and then what we have also is two Macbeths. So we have David Tennant and Ralph Fiennes, who are two very different actors as well, both with strong Shakespeare history, although Tennant a little bit more on the comedy side. But still, David Tennant is doing it at the Donmar, small, enclosed, intimate venue. Ralph Fiennes is doing, I think it's Liverpool, Edinburgh, London, and then overseas, New York or Washington, repurposed warehouses. And I love the idea of this because it's a raw, gritty, dark, rough play. So I like the idea of seeing I can't wait to see what they're going to do with a warehouse and make it, I guess, maybe industrial. And he has got the most glorious Lady Macbeth, which is...
I was just going to say, who's playing Lady Macbeth?
Indira Varma, who I'm a huge fan of. And
is she with both of them? Or
no, she's with Ralph Fiennes.
Oh, she's with Fiennes.
So she's Ralph Fiennes. And I've seen her in The Seagull before, and obviously Game of Thrones. She's got so much presence. And Lady Macbeth is a shockingly small role, actually. I saw it a year or two ago with Irish actress Saoirse Ronan, who I'm an absolute enormous fan of. But there's not a lot to do, but it requires a lot of presence. And Indira Varma is, for me, a goddess. So I'm very excited about that.
I'm digging deep back into my O-level Macbeth. I did Macbeth for O-level, so I always remember it. I was going to say fondly, maybe not so fondly, but in any event.
No, it's not fun.
So, I mean, are we in danger of having a little bit too much Shakespeare? I mean, my goodness, one can never ask that with all these different adaptations going on. Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of wonderful, actually, to have two actors. They'll both be in London at the same time, into sort of January, February next year. They'll overlap. And I think that's rather tantalising. It's a little bit delicious. And I don't know how...
there'll be so much comparison.
Yes, there will be.
It'll be unreal.
But that, competition is good. But also Shakespeare is glorious, wonderful. It can be overdone. It can be dry. It can be tiresome. It can be very long. It's all about what you do with it. I have genuinely fallen asleep during Shakespeare, but I also saw the Saoirse Ronan Macbeth was electrifying. One of the best things I've ever seen up at the Almeida. It was like being inside a film of a dream, of a dark, feverish... So it's what you do with it. And I'm up for it, and I like the idea of both these actors. I want to see both of them. So yes, with caveats, but yeah.
You'll be a busy boy next year. Anyway, we're going to thank Stefan for coming in, as always, and having the conversation about the arts. We're now going to take you live to Hiroshima in Japan, where the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is speaking after meeting with G7 leaders. Let's have a little listen in.
I cannot tell you how many. This is not a secret. I really don't know. But as for the weapons, I wouldn't like to mention some of that, but so far, because we just don't have it. So far, still, the question is also very global. Artillery. There should be artillery. As for your third question, as for the counter-offensive, I do apologize. All of your questions are of such a character, that of not such a nature, so that I need to answer in a very common manner. Russia will feel when we'll have a counter-offensive. Thank you, dear colleagues. I do remind you, one question each, please. Let us respect all the rest of the journalists. The question from the left, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hugh Remington from Channel 10 in Australia. You met two leaders of major democratic nations, or not members of the G7, India and Australia. Can you tell us what you felt you got from your conversations with Mr. Modi? And Mr. Albanese of Australia has said that he doesn't rule out offering more support to Ukraine, but wants to do so in negotiations with your government. Did you have any discussions about anything new that Australia might do?
We are working with Australia, that is true. I cannot disclose any details. We had certain deliveries. We are grateful for those packages of support. We had a very nice meeting, the visit to Kiev, and I'm really grateful for that. And in fact, the visits of all of the leaders who are not afraid to come to us during the war, that is very respectful. As of Australia, India, the countries which do not belong to G7, for us the most important thing, just understand me, we don't have accidental meetings. I cannot afford myself to have accidental meetings because we are at war. I don't have time for that, really. So we were in Saudi Arabia before. We are working to involve the maximum amount of countries, number of countries with totally different continents, to involve all of them into diplomatic pressure onto Russia through the peace formula which is offered by Ukraine. This is why all of those meetings are important for us. Not only to be insisting as for the participants in the summit, no, but to be understood, comprehensible, because sometimes we understand that it is very...
And that was Vladimir Zelensky speaking there at the G7 in Japan. You're watching Sunday with Arlene Foster on GB News, Britain's news channel. Stay with us after 12 o'clock. We'll be entering the world of espionage. We're joined by two former intelligence officers to discuss the CIA's latest tactic to recruit Russian spies. We'll also be speaking to RHS gold medal winning gardener Dave Green about whether you should weed your garden or not. And we'll have analysis of those local council elections in Northern Ireland. But before all that, here's your weather.
Hello there, welcome to your GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Having a look at the rest of today for the far north of the country, Northern Ireland and Scotland, we will continue to see some patchy rain, and that's all down to this cold front, which will gradually weaken as the rest of the day goes on, as high pressure begins to really dominate across the country. So having a look at this afternoon in a bit more detail, we can see the area of cloud and rain across Northern Ireland and Scotland. Probably the main bulk of the rain will be across eastern Scotland, maybe some sunshine for the Northern Isles later on, but the best of the sunshine really across England and Wales. We just need to watch out for some low cloud which may just come in from time to time off the North Sea. So better the temperatures out towards the west, where we will see highs reaching 21 or possibly 22 degrees. Into this evening, a fine end to the weekend really for England and Wales. Still the risk of some rain overnight across eastern Scotland, but this whole area of cloud and rain will continue to break up as the night goes on. Maybe the odd shower too for the very far north of Scotland. But under the cloud and rain, a fairly mild night. But for Wales and Midlands, just like last night, it could be another chilly one, with temperatures as low as 1 or 2 degrees in a few prone spots. But for most, we start the new working week on a fairly quiet note. Still the risk of some low cloud at times across the east, and again, still some spits and spots of rain for eastern Scotland. But for most, a fairly fine and sunny Monday to come. Lots of sunshine, especially in the west, where we will see temperatures potentially climb up to 23 degrees in a few spots. So feeling quite warm, but to take note of high UV levels if you are out and about. Into the evening, very little changes. Could just see the odd shower across the Pennines developing from time to time, but I think most of us will end Monday on a dry and fine note. And then the dry and fine conditions continuing as we look ahead to Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. In the sunshine, feeling quite warm. Potentially, by the time we get to Thursday, we could be up into the mid-20s.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the second hour of Sunday with Arlene Foster on GB News. Well, we've got a packed schedule ahead until the 1 o'clock news, starting off with a look at the seismic changes that are coming to the rental market if Michael Gove manages to pass his renters reform bill. Landlords are up in arms while tenants have welcomed the move but called for further action. We'll discuss the battle also in Ukraine, which rumbles on, not just on the ground, but in the cyber world. We'll be joined by two former US intelligence officers to analyse the latest efforts by the CIA to recruit Russian spies. Plus, council elections in Northern Ireland have returned large gains for the main Nationalist Party, Sinn Féin. What does it mean for Northern Ireland? And do you ever get sick of weeding the garden? Well, if you follow the latest advice, maybe you don't have to. We'll be joined by an RHS gold medal garden designer to ask whether it's really old-fashioned to remove weeds. Finally, we'll hear from the director of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young, who's weighing into the furore at Oxford University over an attempt to pressure the debating society for inviting a gender-critical feminist to an event. All of that to come, but first, let's get the latest news headlines with Bethany.
Arlene, thank you. Good afternoon. Here's your latest stories from the GB newsroom at 1 minute past midday. Opposition leaders are calling for an investigation after it emerged the Home Secretary tried to avoid incurring points on a driving licence for speeding last summer. The Sunday Times reports Suella Braverman asked a civil servant to organise a one-to-one driving awareness course instead. The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, described the allegations as shocking, saying Miss Braverman's role is to uphold the law, and yet she abused her position to get around it. When asked about the claims, the Prime Minister declined to support Miss Braverman.
I don't know the full details of what has happened, nor have I spoken to the Home Secretary. I think you can see firsthand what I've been doing over the last day or so. But I understand that she's expressed regret for speeding, accepted the penalty and paid the fine.
On the final day of the G7 summit in Japan, world leaders have set out their plans to tackle aggression from China. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said Beijing posts the biggest challenge to global security, being the only country with both the means and intent to reshape world order. US President Joe Biden says there's complete resolve and unity within the G7 to work together to firstly recognise China as a threat, but also to reduce the risk to international security.
We're not looking to decouple from China. We're looking to de-risk and diversify our relationship with China. That means taking steps to diversify our supply chains, and we're not dependent on any one country for necessary product. It means resisting economic coercion together and countering harmful practices that hurt our workers. It means protecting a narrow set of advanced technologies critical for our national security.
Rishi Sunak has also hailed the President of Ukraine's attendance at the summit as historic. This morning, Volodymyr Zelensky and Japan's Prime Minister visited the Peace Memorial Park in Hiroshima. They've taken part in a wreath-laying ceremony at the cenotaph for the victims of the atomic bomb. President Zelensky has also held bilateral talks with his Japanese counterpart and in the last few moments has made a speech at the summit. We'll, of course, bring you the latest on that here at GB News. Meanwhile, President Zelensky has called the situation in eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut a tragedy, but he didn't confirm that it had fallen to Russian control. When asked if the city had been captured, he said, "I think not." But he did admit there is nothing left there. Wagner mercenary forces who have led the assault claim to have finally pushed Ukrainians out of the city, and President Vladimir Putin has congratulated them for what he called a liberation. The Environment Secretary says scrapping EU laws would boost the UK's domestic wine industry by £180 million. A number of Brussels regulations that were retained after Brexit will be dropped as part of the retained EU law bill, including some that impact the wine sector. Therese Coffey's comments come after the government watered down plans to scrap all EU laws. Just 600 will now be removed from British statute books rather than the 4,000 pledged. The Labour leader is expected to warn the NHS is not sustainable unless serious and long-term reforms are made. Sir Keir Starmer will make a speech in the east of England to set out fundamental changes, extra investment and performance targets. The Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting has previously called government plans to use private sector capacity a short-term fix. And Sinn Féin has become the largest party in local government in Northern Ireland for the first time after making large gains in the elections. The party's Vice President Michelle O'Neill described her victory as momentous and said the results sent a message that Stormont should return to power sharing. DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson admitted lessons needed to be learned from the results, but said his party had polled strongly. Sinn Féin now holds 144 seats, whilst the DUP has 122 and the Alliance Party has 67. You're up to date on GB News. Now it's back to Arlene.
Welcome back to the show, and thanks to Bethany for the news. Well, a regulatory bombshell is about to hit Britain's property rental market with the introduction by Michael Gove of his Renters Reform Bill. The bill will bring in a raft of measures designed mainly to protect tenants from unscrupulous landlords. That includes banning so-called no-fault evictions, where a tenant can be asked to leave without any reason being given. Landlords will also be unable to raise rents more than once a year or to, quote, unreasonably refuse pets. As expected, the bill has divided opinion neatly between those who rent out property and those renting it. To discuss this and to have a conversation about the bill that's coming, I'm joined by property agent Abdul Kawi Karim and from the Priced Out campaign for affordable housing, Freddie Poser. Well, I'm going to come to you first, Freddie. Obviously, this is something that you welcome. Does it go far enough for you?
Well, I think the bill is going to be an interesting one. I think the way tenants have been feeling for the last few decades is that they are at the complete whims of the landlords. They can be kicked out of the flat with very little notice. Rents can be raised whenever the landlord feels like it. However, I don't think that the Renters Reform Bill, whilst a good step in the right direction, is necessarily the right option. We'd much prefer to see it priced out, that the government focus on expanding the supply of properties, because the real protection that a tenant can have is the option to say to their landlord, well, I can get a cheaper rent somewhere else. In the end, one of the things that gives landlords so much power is that there aren't enough properties to rent. So you have to accept whatever they're going to offer you. We're campaigning that one of the things that should be returned in this bill is legal aid for tenants in rental disputes. We think that that would make a big difference to enforcing these rights. But part of the issue is hard to enforce a right when you don't have other options. So the key thing will be to expand the supply.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it, Abdullah? And presumably you would like to see more homes built as well. But what's your initial reaction to this proposed bill?
The initial reaction to this proposed bill, I know a lot of landlords will be upset with the no-fault eviction, but I do say that it is fair because it's balanced with the Section 8, that if you do want to evict a tenant, if they're antisocial or their rent arrears, you do have these options. So it kind of does balance the scale. But like you said, we need to consider the fact that there's not options. So including this may lead some landlords to want to sell or leave the market again, which is not going to be helpful because it's going to reduce the supply. So really our focus is to get into more development. So my company, Ace Investment Properties, what we do is we work with developers and landlords and encourage them to do new things like work with the permit development rights, to convert commercial properties, to create more housing so we can really boost the economy.
And are you seeing landlords saying to you, well, we're just going to sell up, we're fed up with this, we're being pressed again?
See, this is the thing, because this is a step. It's not, we can't look at this as a single occasion. There's loads of things. There's the increase in the interest rates. There's the Section 24 changes. So as part of this bill, landlords are going to have to be a part of it.
Explain what you mean by Section 24 changes for those of us not in the market.
So the Section 24 changes, to make it quick, is that essentially when you were operating your rental business, you could deduct your mortgage interest. So a lot of landlords have mortgages.
Yes.
So you could deduct it from your tax bill so you'd pay less tax.
I see, right, OK.
Now the government have changed it so you will pay the full tax on all of your income, even though some of it is costs. So that can literally wipe out 50% of the profits for a landlord.
Yeah.
So if you look at it, this is pushing a lot of landlords to the short-term rental market. Because if you're looking at a serviced accommodation, you don't have these Section 24. So it seems like the government is encouraging landlords to not even deal with tenants, and they're placing this wedge in between when we should be working together to get more property.
I mean, this bill, there's a lot in it that I don't think anybody could argue with, particularly the issue of not being able to have rent rises within a year, because that's been a real problem, Freddie, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think that it's not unreasonable that landlords should have to set out when they're going to raise the rent so that people can, plan their financial year. I think that's very reasonable. I think more worrying is what is this going to look like for the rental sector as a whole, and especially in high-cost areas where we already don't have enough rental properties.
And Abdul's saying that some of the landlords will simply say, right, I'm not going to have this anymore.
Absolutely, and what's interesting is, as Abdul has pointed out, there are weird quirks in the UK tax code that can push you towards other forms of accommodation that I think we want, short-term lets, for example, which aren't as beneficial as having people actually give people a safe home. So the key thing about the Renters Reform Bill is to get the balance right, making sure that renters are protected, because there are some really bad landlords out there, and some of the stories are utterly heartbreaking, how people feel completely insecure in their own home and they can't start a family because you might be kicked out.
Yeah.
we need to balance that with making sure there are places for people to live. It's not about a tiny violin for landlords, but it is about making sure there are high-quality properties available on the market. And the way to do that, what Michael Gove really should be doing, is building those houses, building places for people to live.
And where would you say he needs to build those houses? Because, of course, there's always this big debate about, the green belt and all of that sort of thing. I mean, where would you build those new houses?
Absolutely. I think there are lots of places you could build them. I think, as the Labour Party is starting to say, we need to have a discussion about parts of the green belt. When I was here yesterday, actually, I was talking about how the green belt isn't all green, and there are parts that I don't think anyone would miss.
You mean it's sort of brown, as we would call it?
It's brown field. It's brown field, but green belt. So green field and green belt aren't necessarily the same thing.
Yeah.
But if you want to protect the green belt, then the other thing you could do is build up in cities. You could, add stories, build on tube station car parks, and we see opposition to that as well. It's not necessarily one or the other, but we need to pick some development to go ahead because we desperately need more homes in this country.
And do you think, Abdul, that the government has listened to the concerns of landlords? Because obviously they've been working with people in the tenant sector. Do you think they've listened to landlords?
Not a chance.
No?
Not a chance.
That's pretty clear.
A lot of the landlords I know, being honest, they feel like there's a wealth grab going on.
Yeah.
They feel like all of these increase in costs leading them to sell off, and it's just a ploy to get landlords out of the market. And it is quite sad to see. It is quite sad to see. I do not feel like landlords are working. The government is working with landlords. I feel like they're completely opposed to landlords. And if anything, they're trying to put a wedge between landlords and renters, especially with bills like this and all of these sensationalized headlines to make it seem like it's landlords versus renters, when really what we want to do is make sure there are decent homes. There are some good things in this bill, such as wanting to have the decent home standards and making sure there are safe spaces. But overall, I do not feel like the government are doing a lot.
And this whole characterisation, and I accept that there are unscrupulous landlords, but they're very much in the minority. And so this characterisations of landlords are bad, poor tenants are under pressure. I mean, it doesn't help.
I think it's important to remember the balance here. Landlords are economic agents. They are there to make money, and that's fine, and they should be regulated at that. At least on an emotional level, these are people's homes. So if you had to come down on one side, I think it's fair for the government to say that more important is that people feel safe in their homes. And as I say, when I talk about the rental market, I'm not interested in what happened to landlords. That's a sort of sectoral interest. But it does matter for renters that landlords feel able to let into the market. And I think that's where we find common ground here. I don't feel bad for landlords, but also I'm worried about the long-term effects this bill could have for the renters that it's meant to protect.
And do you think that conversation between landlords and tenants is something that really, and tenants' organisations is something that needs to happen, Abdul? Because otherwise, things are getting lost in translation here, and actually you're making the market worse.
Absolutely. I feel like with Freddie and landlords and renters, we're all on the same page that there is possibility to make profit in the market, have decent homes, and have everybody together. It is just really looking forward to development and how we can build more new homes and do it in a sustainable way that does boost the economy and everybody prospers. That nobody really needs to suffer if we do it correctly.
Yeah. And Freddie, do you believe that that's something that should happen too, that conversation between landlords and tenants?
Absolutely. There are win-wins out there, and there are good landlords out there who provide good homes for their tenants and provide a real service. It's about making sure the balance is right and protecting people from potentially the minority, but certainly the landlords out there who do exploit their tenants.
Yeah. Well, Freddie, Abdul, thank you so much for coming in and for having that conversation. I'm sure it's a conversation that will continue because this bill is starting its parliamentary process, and that's going to take some time, so I'm sure we'll revert to it again. Now, you're watching Sunday with Arlene Foster and GB News, and in a few minutes we'll delve into the world of espionage with two former American intelligence officers to look at the CIA's latest efforts to recruit Russian spies.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Radio.
Welcome back to the show. And before we talk about espionage and spying, I'm going to talk about tea, because us Brits love a cup of tea, and what better time to put the kettle on than today, International Tea Day. And as the latest tea trends are released, our reporter Anna Riley brings us this report from Britain's biggest tea drinking region.
Tea. We've been drinking it in Britain since the 16th century, and with 10 million cups drunk every day in the UK, it's certainly a popular beverage. And tea production so important that the UN designated the 21st of May as International Tea Day. To tie in with this, the latest tea census found almost a quarter of Brits drink 5 cups or more every day. 77% favoured black tea and 54% rated taste as the top reason for drinking tea. But why is tea so trendy?
A big part of the work that we do at the Tea and Infusions Association is to promote tea and to encourage people to drink tea. And, you know, we talked about the well-being benefits of drinking tea, taking a break, reducing your anxiety, but tea is also packed full of health benefits as well. So it's a great drink to introduce into your diet if you're not doing that already. And there's health benefits. You can find them in black tea and green tea. There's oolong tea, you know, all different types of teas. And I'd recommend people just get out there and try them.
It's places like the Georgian tea rooms in Bridlington that are keeping the British tradition of afternoon tea alive.
I think the joy of a tea rooms is it's just a little bit of escapism from everyday life. People come in here as an experience. They come in for afternoon teas, and it's a sort of a slower pace of life.
With Yorkshire being named as the region with the most tea drinkers, it's not surprising that so many cups are sold here.
We do a wide selection of teas. We do fruit teas, we do herbal teas, but the winner is always the good old Yorkshire tea, always. I think it's just calming, it's refreshing. People enjoy it either first thing on the morning or when they've had a long walk exploring. They come and they sit and enjoy a nice cup of Yorkshire tea.
And for the customers, tea is part of their daily routine.
that's the drink, my go-to drink in the morning. It refreshes, it wakes you up, sets you up for the day. You know, if you're feeling a little bit groggy, sort of, you know, just gives you that time to, you boil the kettle, bit of mindfulness, you know, waiting for it, thinking what you've got ahead of the day, and then you have your tea, and it's nice.
So, whether you favour a builder's brew or a milkier mug, for many of us, having a cuppa is simply tea-rific. Anna Riley, GB News, Bridlington.
Well, welcome back to the show again, and thanks to Anna for that lovely little package on tea. Well, it appears that Russian forces may finally have captured the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut after a vicious months-long assault. But as the war on the ground rumbles on, there's another dimension to the conflict that's been waged online. This week, the CIA released a new video targeted at a Russian audience, encouraging Russians to provide information to the United States. The CIA says that it's aimed at Russians who are disaffected with the war in Ukraine. But the big question is, will it work? Well, to discuss that, I'm joined by former intelligence officers Bob Ayres and Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer. Good morning, or I should say good afternoon to you both. And I suppose I'll start with you, Bob. Is this going to work?
Well, there's really two questions you have to ask. One is, will somebody avail themselves of the opportunity to pass information? And the second question is the information they pass of any utility? The first question is answerable by thinking that if this is targeted toward the Russians, it's targeted toward the Russians that are engaged along the front lines and engaged in combat. Getting information from somebody who lives in Vladivostok is interesting, but irrelevant. So if you're targeting soldiers, what's the likelihood they will actually respond? Well, they've been told if they retreat, they're going to be shot. They've been told if they surrender and they come back to Russia, they're going to spend 10 years in the jail. If they continue to fight, they're probably going to die. So they're being given a option of victory or death. Now, assuming they do decide to talk, which is interesting, the question then becomes, what is the value of the information they provide? If you're targeting people up in the area of combat, you're going to get tactical intelligence, things like what's your unit name, what's your unit number, when's the last time you got fed, where'd you come from. These are all bits of information for building an order of battle picture of the enemy. But the Ukrainians don't need an order of battle picture. They've been engaged with these guys now for a year. They know who they are. They know where they are. They know how they fight. So the question becomes then, what's the utility of this CIA video? And that really becomes an interesting question because I don't see much utility in it.
Yeah. And Tony, I'm interested in your view on this video as to whether it'll work. And indeed, if it does work, what will be the value, as Bob has been talking about there, of the information that comes forward?
It's not going to work. The CIA has tried this before. I've been through their internal CIA vetting training for assets, and the CIA has gotten its lunch eaten a number of times by the Russians on this very issue. The moment this came out, the Russians started planning their counterintelligence program to start feeding information into it. Everything Bob just said, I agree with. He went through all the categories, and the Russians did too. And so what's going to happen now is much what happened in the 70s and 80s with Cuba. Cuba was a huge target of the CIA. The Cuban intelligence service, coached and mentored by the Russians, was able to essentially establish full control of every path forward in the CIA. So I'm very skeptical. I think some contractor at Langley got paid a lot of money to come up with this. And and then plus the other thing, Russia's winning right now. We just learned today that they're doing well. Again, I don't dispute what Bob's saying about the conditions, but for the most part, you're not going to find anybody at the high level where you need to get strategic information from the leadership about plans and intentions. All the other tactical stuff, as Bob said, they've got that. You need intentions at this point. This is not the way to get to intentions of what the Russians are doing.
And I suppose, Tony, you both are experts in this field. I'm not, but I had an idea in my head that espionage is a bit like gathering all the little bits together and putting it together like a jigsaw puzzle and getting a picture of what's going on. But what would you judge to be the most important factor in pushing somebody and motivating a Russian person to come forward with information?
The record is the Russians are most motivated by cash, being able to buy people off. The whole idea of nationalism did not work well. Again, I recruited Russians. This is not something obtuse or alien to me. During the end of the Cold War, especially, we were able to bring a number in. When Berlin fell, we had a number of things going on. The chief of station there was a friend of mine. They were rolling Russians in, but the motivation has to be correct. Again, when you're having a war where they're winning, and for the most part, Vladimir Putin's approval rate is high, the approach they're making where, oh, you must feel bad about what you're doing, is just simply not going to work. And again, I think that this will only help the Russians establish counterintelligence feed information and paths into the CIA.
Yeah, and we're watching photographs of your president there with Vladimir Zelensky, who spoke with the G7 leaders this morning. Bob, tell me, do the CIA really think that this is going to bring them information, or is it an attempt to try and stir up trouble in Russia? I mean, is this something that you think is genuine, or is it just there to rattle the Russians?
If it's a legitimate attempt to stir up trouble in Russia, then I think the CIA is deluding themselves. I agree with our other guests that this is probably the product of a contractor who was paid a lot of money to come up with a video. I guess the way I would describe what we're seeing in front of us is, never confuse activity with achievement. And this video is not going to accomplish anything. It'll make somebody happy that they put it out, and they'll pat themselves on the back, but it's going to ultimately be valueless.
Yeah. And just briefly from both of you, is this something, do you think that the CIA would have shared this information or video with their colleagues in the international community, the Five Eyes community, before they sent it out? Or is it something that they just put out themselves? Tony, I'll come to you first.
Look, the CIA is very much integrated with the Five Eyes, but something like this, this has a propaganda value which goes beyond intelligence collection, as Bob just said. I agree with his assessment. I don't necessarily know if they shared it or not. I think this may have been something that they mentioned in a meeting, saying, "Oh, by the way, we're going to do this." If it was coordinated, I think you would have seen other Five Eye nations doing something to support it. I don't see an overall global coordinated effort. So that tells me that, yeah, they maybe were notified, but they weren't necessarily either on board or directly in support of the video. So again, I just don't see the value of this other than some contractor getting paid a lot of money to develop it.
Yeah. Yeah. And Bob, would you agree with this assessment from Tony? Bob?
I think if the CIA would have shown this video to the other Five Eyes membership, they would have been discouraged from playing it. They would have been told, well, that's really nice, but we don't see the purpose in this. What are you trying to accomplish? They would have been critiqued by professional intelligence officers, and the results of that critique would have been don't show this darn thing.
Yeah. Yeah. OK, well, huge thanks to both of you for coming on to discuss this interesting assessment from the CIA and their decision to put out this video to Russians and get them to come forward. Thanks to Bob Ayres and Lieutenant Colonel Tony Sheffer for coming on this morning. Now, you're watching Sunday with Arlene Foster and GB News. In a few minutes, we'll be looking at those council election results in Northern Ireland. But first, here's a reminder of this afternoon's latest news.
Arlene, thank you. Here's your latest from the GB newsroom at 12:30. Opposition leaders are calling for an investigation after it emerged the Home Secretary tried to avoid incurring points on her driving licence for speeding last summer. The Sunday Times reports Suella Braverman asked a civil servant to organise a one-to-one driving awareness course instead. Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper described the allegations as shocking, saying Miss Braverman's role is to uphold the law, and yet she abused her position to get around it. On the final day of the G7 summit in Japan, world leaders have set out their plans to tackle aggression from China. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said Beijing poses the biggest challenge to global security, being the only country with both the means and intent to reshape world order. The president of Ukraine has addressed world leaders at the G7 summit, saying he's confident Kyiv's peace formula has the potential to prevent future wars. He's thanked Western allies for their ongoing support, including receiving American-made F-16 jets and for the training of Ukrainian pilots. Volodymyr Zelensky has dismissed claims the Russian mercenary Wagner Group have captured the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. When asked if the city had been captured, he said, "I think not." But he did admit there is nothing left there. The Environment Secretary says scrapping EU laws would boost the UK's domestic wine industry by £180 million. A number of Brussels regulations that were retained after Brexit will be dropped as part of the retained EU law bill, including some that impact the wine sector. Therese Coffey's comments come after the government watered down plans to scrap all EU laws. Just 600 will now be removed from British statute books rather than 4,000 pledged. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Arlene.
Well, much anticipated council elections took place in Northern Ireland on Thursday, 2 weeks after they happened here in England, and the results are now complete. And while my own former party, the DUP, has held firm on its previous tally of 122 council seats across Northern Ireland, the Nationalist vote seems to have swung firmly behind Sinn Féin, who increased their number of council seats by 39, making them the largest party in local government. The Alliance Party also gained seats, while the Ulster Unionists and Social Democratic and Labour Party both lost out. Well, now let's get the latest from our reporter in Northern Ireland, Dougie Beattie. Dougie, take us through what has happened over this past couple of days.
Well, good afternoon, Arlene, and welcome to beautiful Cumber, Scadrick Island, just sitting in behind me. And yes, a great day for Sinn Féin, but 144 seats, about 39% of the vote. But this is nothing new in Northern Ireland. 1998, the SDLP and Sinn Féin between them held 39.9% of the votes in Northern Ireland. And basically what has happened here, as we have been discussing the last year or so, is that we are now heading towards a three-party state, because the SDLP has shrank and the Sinn Féin has gobbled up most of their voters and brought them into the fold. So nationalism is just funneling in to one part, and they, between them, have about 39.9% of the vote. So that's where it was in 1998. The difference being, of course, is that the unionist parties now have shrank. The DUP stayed exactly where it is, so it remains the same size, but the Ulster Unionist Party, who are a very liberal party, have lost about 16 seats. Now, in this is a problem for Chris Heaton-Harris, who has been trying to get Stormont back up and running, because he has basically threatened the DUP with election after election. And if we ran Stormont elections again tomorrow, Sinn Féin would come back as the largest party. They already are in Stormont. The DUP would be in second place. And of course, the Alliance Party then would become in to third place. And those big three would control how Stormont runs, because it is done on consent. That's part of the Good Friday Agreement. One can't run without the other side of the community. So really what this is showing is that unionism is pretty much behind the DUP, and liberal unionism is losing out here, because they are also saying, no, we support the DUP stance where it is. We do not want this framework document. We don't want the protocol. And on the other side, nationalism is growing, but one can't operate without the other. And what we will now see, as we have seen over the last few weeks, is real pressure coming indirectly from media releases, etc. And what we're talking about here is the management and access for the media to political parties and what is put out every single day. And this is done very, very successfully by the SNP for years. So what we will now see over the next few weeks and months is calls for border polls, and that one department can't operate, and certain aspects of the media will run these stories and continue to run them. And this is where the media has to play a very, very vital role in democracy, but it also has to be able to ask questions without being managed.
Well, thanks, Dougie, for that. And just when you mentioned the media, we're now going to go for more reaction. And I'm happy to be joined by the editor of the Belfast newsletter, Ben Lowry. Ben, thanks so much for joining me this morning. Well, you heard what Dougie had to say there about what he thinks is going to happen now. First of all, I wanted to ask you for your reaction to the elections on Thursday.
Well, I would say, on the one hand, I do edit a unionist newspaper, as of course you know, but for any viewers who do not know, from a unionist perspective, the bad result is that I think this is the first time that unionism has fallen behind Irish nationalism in terms of total votes. I don't think that has happened before. And that's not a day that any unionist will celebrate. It's only slightly behind, and it was only slightly ahead before. That's the bad news. The good news, and we always have to try to look at the good news from a unionist perspective, is that the Irish nationalists, the combined SDLP, and particularly Sinn Féin, as we're hearing, haven't done so well, vote hasn't really risen. It's a little bit round about 40% in this election. It hasn't actually really risen in 25 years. So you could say that it's still all to play for. But I wouldn't want to get away from and be overly sort of sunny about things. I don't think we can get away from the fact that Sinn Féin has consolidated its position in front. It was a party that came first in the Stormont Assembly elections and has come first in this election. And there's a lot of denigrating of unionists and saying that they don't want Sinn Féin around and they don't want to share power with Sinn Féin and so on and so forth. And this is an attempt always to present unionists as the unreasonable ones. Of course, it is traumatic for unionists, and unionists have shown great willingness to share power with Sinn Féin for most of the last 25 years. It is traumatic for unionists to have a party that was inextricably linked to the IRA. That's in the past, but it is actually increasingly triumphalist about IRA terrorism. Yeah. And it's winning over a lot of young people in this. And one of the reasons is the decency of the great bulk of the population in Northern Ireland, particularly the older people who remember the Troubles, who didn't support terrorism. And they didn't support terrorism in our neighbours in the Republic of Ireland. And there have been many differences and many reasons why unionists haven't been happy with what's happened down south, and many reasons why people down south haven't been happy with what happens up here. But the Republic of Ireland completely repudiated Sinn Féin when terrorism was ongoing. It got between 1% and 4% of the vote from the early 1980s when it started contesting elections to the late 1990s. And of course, we don't need to talk about England, Scotland and Wales, where the opposition to the IRA would be almost universal. So that is a difficult moment. And, this is a big result for Sinn Féin. And unionism has, to a very substantial degree, held its position. But there are challenges ahead, for sure.
Yeah, and I know that one of the issues that will now come up is surely from nationalists, Republicans, and unfortunately from some mainstream media people, that this means that we should be talking about a border poll. But actually, the point you've made about that 40% hasn't actually grown. It just means Sinn Féin has consolidated. And actually, if you look at the total electorate in Northern Ireland, it comes out at 33%. So the border poll piece is always pushed forward on these occasions. But actually, when you look at the reality of it, there is not the support there for that border poll.
Yeah, I think there isn't. And this is such an important point. Now, I would imagine that most people watching GB News are supporters of Brexit. And I was very sympathetic to Brexit myself, but I came out against Brexit because I thought that it was a risk from a unionist perspective. I'm very pleased to report that in the same way that in Scotland, there hasn't been, the different polls show different things, and I don't think any unionist in Scotland or any unionist in Northern Ireland should be complacent. No. But there hasn't been the movement that some of us would have feared. And I think some of the most significant apparent movement, different polls. There's internet polls which tend to show high support for United Ireland. There's face-to-face polls which tend to show lower support. But there was a period it seemed to be moving that way in the years after Brexit. It's retreating from that, which is very interesting, very reassuring. I think it might be to do with a whole range of things, like from COVID to the coronation, to there are still these things that make people think in terms of the nation and make people think here who haven't often, the real target areas, the people in the middle who don't think very hardly about it. And they find and know intuitively that the UK is a very comfortable place to live. And there hasn't been, and there was the danger that Brexit would sort of upend that, and that hasn't been happening. So yes, there's definitely no mandate for a border poll. That's the first point. The second point is this: the UK, ever generous, ever fair, UK, too generous, you could say, has said to Scotland and Northern Ireland, 50% in one and you can go. No say for the rest of the country, except insofar as an ability to limit when such referendums happen. Spain certainly doesn't say that about its regions. France doesn't say that about its territory. Yeah. The United States doesn't even have a mechanism in its incredible constitution for an exit for say, Alaska. So the UK, having been so generous to say 50% plus one and you can go, certainly has the right to say, well, the conditions for a referendum aren't there. So I think that's a really important point that unionists need to make now. There's not a prospect that this particular election gives anything like a mandate for a border poll, because, as you say, if you take the actual number of people voting for pro-nationalist parties, which hasn't moved in 25 years in the first instance, and then when taken as a percentage of a very low turnout, I don't think unionists have that to be worried about. They've other cultural pressures on them that they do have to worry about.
Well, thanks so much, Ben, for joining me this afternoon. It's good to hear from you. Thanks for that. Now, you're watching Sunday with Arlene Foster on GB News, and after the break, we'll be entering weedy territory, asking whether it's really old-fashioned to weed your garden.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Is watching.
Welcome back to the show. Now, Oxford University has found itself at the centre of the latest free speech row to engulf the British education sector. 44 academics at the university have written an open letter insisting that universities must remain a place where contentious views can be openly discussed. It's after the university's student union appeared to retaliate against the Oxford Union Debating Society for inviting gender-critical feminist Kathleen Stock to an event. Well, I'm joined to discuss this by the director of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young. Toby, thanks for joining me today. Were you surprised at the Students' Union in Oxford taking this action?
Well, I was perhaps not that surprised that the Students' Union decided to punish the Oxford Union, seemingly for inviting Kathleen Stock to speak and then refusing to no-platform her when they came under pressure, not just from the Oxford University LGBTQ+ society, which falsely claimed that Kathleen Stock was campaigning against trans rights, supported conversion therapy, labelled some of the organisations Kathleen Stock supports, like the LGB Alliance, as hate groups. I mean, hysterical, hyperbolic language, but nonetheless, it had an impact. And the Oxford Students' Union said to the Debating Society, you can no longer exhibit at Freshers' Fair this autumn. And that was a huge blow to the Debating Society, one of the oldest debating societies in the country, because without being able to sell its wares, set out its stall at Freshers' Fair, it would have a serious difficulty surviving financially, because it gets about half of its annual sign-ups from new students at that event. So it was a really vicious thing to do by the Students' Union, and various junior common rooms at Oxford also called for the Debating Society to rescind the invitation. The Debating Society held firm, didn't rescind the invitation, so that's why the Students' Union punished it in this way. But thanks to an intervention, not just from these 44 academics who wrote a letter to the Telegraph saying Kathleen Stock must be allowed to speak, we can't behave this way when speakers whose views we might find disagreeable are coming onto our campus. We should engage with them, listen to them, debate with them, not try and silence them. That was important. And the Free Speech Union also intervened. We wrote a letter to the Oxford University proctors, the organisation responsible for student discipline, saying you need to hold the Students' Union to account. They're acting contrary to Oxford University's free speech policy. And there's a new law that's just been passed, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. And what the Students' Union is doing will soon be unlawful under this new law. This new law imposes new obligations on universities and students' unions to uphold and promote free speech on campus. So it would soon be contrary to that new law when it becomes activated. And as a result, the university vice-chancellor intervened and put pressure on the students' union to change its mind, and it has now changed its mind. It's done a U-turn. The Debating Society will, after all, be allowed to set out its stall at Freshers' Fair, which is fantastic. So it's a real victory for free speech. The censorious activists have been faced down and seen off. I mean, they're still going to protest on the day. They're going to try and disrupt this talk on May 31st by Kathleen Stock, but it's going to go ahead. That's the critical thing. And I think if you can stand up to the no platformers, if you can say, no, we're going to allow this person to speak, however disagreeable you might find her views, they're perfectly lawful. In fact, they're pretty mainstream. They're the same views that most people in the country hold. And she has every right to speak and set out her case in the public square. If you disagree with her, come and argue with her, come and debate with her, discuss your disagreements in the debating chamber. That's what it's for. Don't try and silence her. That's not what should happen.
Toby, I mean, I find it incredible that a university, particularly Oxford University, academics have to write and remind students that the whole purpose is to have an open debate. I mean, it's the Oxford Debating Society. People take different positions. They have debates. Surely it's incredible that this has to be done in this day and age. I just find it amazing.
It is incredible, Arlene. But at the Free Speech Union, we find this kind of thing happening all the time. We had to intervene recently to make sure a debate by the Exeter University Debating Society wasn't cancelled. We've intervened at Royal Holloway because the Royal Holloway Debating Society no-platformed Claire Fox. Often the reason given for cancelling these events, no-platforming people by societies which describe themselves as debating societies, is that, well, we're perfectly prepared to debate a broad range of views, but we won't allow hate speech. We have a no platform for hate speech policy. And then they describe the gender critical views of, philosophers like Kathleen Stock, who believe that sex is binary and immutable, as hate speech. So they designate it, they brand it hate speech, and on that basis say, we're very pro-free speech, we're just not pro-free speech for hate speech. But of course, who's to decide what's hateful speech? If it's not against the law, if it's not stirring up hatred under the Public Order Act, then, it's not, legally speaking, hate speech. You may find it disagreeable, you may disapprove of these particular points of views, but that doesn't make them hateful. That's just a way of trying to sidestep an argument. And these debating societies, I think, if they're going to survive and continue to attract students and funding, they need to grow up a bit and tell their members that if they find these views disagreeable, if they find them upsetting or even offensive, that's not a reason to silence the speakers. Come and debate with them, hear what they have to say.
Yeah, and I find it incredible that it's up to these people to decide what is hate speech and what is not hate speech. I mean, I think Kathleen Stock has also referenced the fact that they've had Martin McGuinness to speak in the past, but yet he can speak, but she wasn't allowed to, and I just find that incredible. But do you think, Toby, that this is a turning point in this battle to maintain free speech, given the legislation that's now there and the fact that the Students' Union have now allowed this debate to go ahead, or rather the debate is going ahead and they're allowing the Oxford Debating Union at their Freshers' stand as well?
Well, I think it's an important victory. It's a battle won, and other universities often take their lead from Oxford and Cambridge. They are our leading universities. They're at the top of the global league table. And if they make it clear that they're not going to stand for censorious student mobs trying to silence speakers they find disagreeable, I think that does have an impact in the rest of the sector. It shows that this new Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which has just received royal assent, is having an impact already. That's very important. But it's a war, not a battle. So there'll be many more battles to come, Arlene.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thanks, Toby. Thanks for coming on the show and telling us all about what was happening at the Oxford Union. Now, Emily Carver is up after my show, and Emily is here. I'm very sad to report, though, before I talk to Emily, that we have lost the gardener, and unfortunately we're not going to be able to speak about weeding our gardens, because I was weeding my garden this week, and then I came to the show and was told that weeding gardening is so passé now. You let your weeds go everywhere, apparently.
Well, where I'm living at the moment, the weeds are very much living their best life.
Yes,
well,
exactly.
You could call them wildflowers, I guess, if you're going to be
I don't mind wildflowers. I like wildflowers. Well, I like wildflowers. I do not like weeds. And I was going to have a bit of a debate there, but it's not going to happen, unfortunately. Well, anyway, tell us what's coming up in your show.
We've got a lot coming up, actually. I'm very much looking forward to one of our first guests who's coming on, who is Simon Mayle. Now, he's a former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff. I'm going to be asking him, G7 Summit, has it just been a talking shop? Has it been a bit pointless? Lots of world leaders, stroking each other's egos? Or has there been real progress in some of the biggest issues that we're facing, not least Ukraine, and also the threat of China? I also want to discuss Suella Braverman. Has she been a wrong-un? Has she done something wrong? Or is this another case of the civil service not liking her and perhaps leaking information that shouldn't really be at the top of the news agenda? We'll debate that too. And then the Sunday Times Rich List. With lots of names there, lots of young people earning huge amounts.
Are you making a
money.
declaration before the show?
No, sadly not. I do not appear on this. But, one can aspire.
One can aspire.
But do we care about it? Cost of living crisis, do we care? Do we worry that millionaires are leaving the country? Billionaires are leaving the country. Should we worry? We'll be debating that too.
Well, Emily, it sounds like a great show, and I just want to say thank you to all of my guests for coming on the show today. Michael will be back next week, and until then, goodbye.
Hello there, welcome to your GB News weather forecast from the Met Office. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to the week ahead, for most of us it should be mainly dry with some spells of sunshine. A little bit of rain from time to time across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and that's really how we're going to end the weekend. We still had this cold front here. It will weaken as we head into Monday as this area of high pressure really begins to dominate across the United Kingdom. But before we get there, you can see it across Northern Ireland and Scotland as we end Sunday. Probably the most persistent rain across eastern Scotland, where further south across England and Wales, lots of clear skies around, especially out towards the west. But that could allow it to turn quite chilly. So just like last night, we could see temperatures as low as 1 or 2 degrees across some prone spots of Wales and the Midlands. But for most, as we start the new working week, it should be fairly quiet. Best of the sunshine will be initially across many western parts of the UK. At